In the rolling hills of Montana, where the wind carries secrets and the silence holds both grief and grace, a man named Thomas Mitchell had learned to live with ghosts. For 3 years he'd walked the same paths, tended the same fields, and slept in the same empty house where laughter once echoed through rooms, now thick with dust and memory. He thought he knew every sound his property made, the creak of barn doors in the evening breeze, the rustle of corn stalks in autumn, the gentle lowing of cattle at dawn. But on a cold October morning, when frost painted the grass silver and his breath hung in the air like unspoken prayers, Thomas heard something that didn't belong. Voices, soft, desperate whispers coming from the old red barn where he stored hay and kept his late wife's gardening tools. Voices that would change everything he thought he knew about survival, kindness, and the unexpected ways broken hearts can heal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock hadn't worked in 8 months, but Thomas Mitchell's body knew when 5 a.m. arrived. His eyes opened to darkness so complete it felt like being buried alive. And for the first few seconds of every morning, he forgot that Sarah wasn't lying beside him anymore. Her auburn hair spread across the pillow like autumn leaves. Forgot that her coffee cup wouldn't be waiting on the kitchen counter, still warm from her early rising. Forgot that he was 42 years old and utterly, devastatingly alone. The remembering always came like a punch to the chest. Thomas sat up slowly, joints protesting the cold that had settled into the old farmhouse overnight. October in Whitefish. Montana didn't forgive anyone, not the living, not the grieving, not the stubborn widowers who refused to turn on the heat until November. The floorboards groaned under his bare feet as he padded to the window, peering through glass fogged with his own breath. Outside, the world lay frozen in silver twilight. His property stretched for nearly 200 acres, most of it pasture land where his small herd of cattle huddled together for warmth. The barn stood like a dark sentinel against the pale sky, its red paint faded and peeling from 3 decades of mountain weather. Sarah had always talked about repainting it bright red like the barns in her childhood picture books, she'd said. But Sarah had talked about a lot of things they'd never gotten around to doing. Thomas pulled on the same. Clothes he'd worn yesterday, faded jeans with a hole in the left knee, a flannel shirt that had belonged to his father, and work boots, so old they'd molded to his feet like loyal dogs. In the kitchen, he made coffee the way he'd made it every morning for 3 years, black, bitter, and in a mug Sarah had bought him for their 5th wedding anniversary. The inscription, "World's Best Husband," had faded until only the ghost of letters remained, but he could still read them if he held the mug up to the light just right. The coffee tasted like nothing. Everything tasted like nothing now. He'd tried, in those first months after the cancer took her, to make the foods she'd loved. Her grandmother's apple pie recipe, the salmon she'd prepared for special occasions, even the simple scrambled eggs she'd made every Sunday morning. But food without someone to share it with wasn't really food at all. It was just fuel. And barely that. Most days, Thomas survived on coffee, whatever leftovers the church ladies still occasionally left on his porch, and the kind of stubborn pride that keeps a man upright when everything inside him wants to crumble. The farm had been Sarah's dream, more than his. She'd grown up in Chicago, all concrete and car horns, but something in her soul had always yearned for wide open spaces and the honest work of growing things. When they'd found this place, a modest 2-story farmhouse with good bones and a barn that leaned slightly to the east but had character, her eyes had lit up like Christmas morning. They'd used every penny of their savings for the down payment, and Thomas had worked double shifts at the lumber mill to make the mortgage payments while Sarah learned to garden, to can vegetables, to coax life from the rocky Montana soil. She'd been better at the farming than he was, truth be told. Her vegetables had won ribbons at the county fair 3 years running. Her flower gardens had been featured in the local newspaper. Neighbors would drive by just to see what new beauty she'd conjured from seeds and soil and sheer determination. Thomas had been the muscle fixing fences, hauling hay, maintaining the equipment, but Sarah had been the heart that made everything grow. Now the gardens were overgrown with weeds. The greenhouse glass was cracked and dark, and the only things Thomas managed to keep alive were the cattle and himself, and some days he wasn't sure about either. He finished his coffee and stepped onto the back porch, where the cold hit him like a slap. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the eastern horizon showed the faintest blush of light. This was his favorite time of day, when the world held its breath between night and morning, when he could almost pretend that Sarah might still be sleeping upstairs and would come down soon to wrap her arms around him from behind while he watched the sunrise. The cattle were already moving toward the fence line, their breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. They knew the routine as well as he did. Feed them first, then check the water troughs, then walk the fence line to make sure no posts had shifted in the night. After that, if he was feeling ambitious, he might tackle one of the 100 small repairs the farm constantly demanded. If not, he'd sit in his truck with the heater running and listen to talk radio until it was late enough to go to bed again. It wasn't much of a life, but it was his life and it required nothing from anyone else. Thomas grabbed the work gloves from the porch rail and headed toward the feed shed. The gravel crunched under his boots, each step echoing in the vast silence that surrounded his property. No neighbors for 2 miles in any direction, no traffic noise, no sounds of other people living their lives within earshot. Just wind, cattle, and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. He'd grown to appreciate the silence, even crave it. In town, people looked at him with a mixture of pity and discomfort, like grief might be contagious. They meant well. The pastor's wife who still brought casseroles, the hardware store owner who always asked how he was doing, the mailman who lingered a few extra seconds, as if waiting for Thomas to say something beyond thanks when he handed over the bills and catalogs. But their kindness felt heavy, obligating him to perform some version of healing he wasn't ready for. Out here, with only the cattle for company, he could be exactly as broken as he felt. The feed shed stood adjacent to the barn, and as Thomas approached with a wheelbarrow full of hay bales, he noticed something that made him pause. The barn door, which he always kept latched tight, was open about 6 inches. Not much, just enough for a slim person to slip through, or for animals to get in and make themselves at home among his stored equipment. Thomas set down the wheelbarrow and approached the barn cautiously. Bears were rare this close to civilization, but not unheard of, especially this time of year when they were bulking up for winter. More likely it was raccoons or maybe a stray dog seeking shelter from the cold. He'd had problems with raccoons before, clever, destructive little bandits that could turn a tidy barn into chaos in a single night. He pulled the door open wider, letting in the pale morning light. The barn smelled of hay and motor oil, leather, and the faint mustiness that comes with age. Sarah's gardening tools still hung on the far wall, exactly where she'd left them 3 springs ago, their handles worn smooth by her small hands. Thomas had never been able to bring himself to move them or give them away, though he had no use for them himself. As his eyes adjusted to the dim interior, he heard it, a sound so soft he almost missed it. A whisper, barely audible, coming from the far corner where he stored extra hay bales. Then another whisper, and what sounded like someone trying very hard not to cough. Thomas froze. His first instinct was to call out, to demand whoever was there show themselves. But something in the quality of those whispers, the fear in them, the desperate quiet, made him hesitate. These weren't the sounds of thieves or vandals. They were the sounds of people hiding, people scared. He moved deeper into the barn, stepping carefully to avoid the creaky boards he knew would give him away. The whispering stopped abruptly, and he could feel the weight of held breath, of people trying to become invisible in the shadows. "I know you're there," Thomas said quietly. his voice rougher than he'd intended from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you." Silence. Then, from behind a stack of hay bales taller than a man, came the sound of muffled crying. Not one voice, but several. Young voices. Female voices. Thomas felt something shift in his chest. A protective instinct he'd thought had died with Sarah's dreams of children they'd never been able to have. He took another step forward, hands raised where they could be seen. "My name is Thomas Mitchell. This is my barn, my property. I don't know who you are or why you're here, but if you're in trouble, maybe I can help." A long pause. Then, barely above a whisper, a voice said, "Please don't call the police." The voice was young, maybe late teens or early 20s, with an accent he couldn't quite place. There was exhaustion in it, and fear, but also a threat of steel that spoke of someone who'd learned to be strong out of necessity. "I'm not calling anyone," Thomas said. "But it's cold in here, and you sound like you might be hurt. Why don't you come out where I can see you?" More whispering, urgent and low. Then, slowly, 3 figures emerged from behind the hay bales like ghosts materializing from shadow. 3 young women, all clearly sisters despite their different heights and coloring. The oldest looked to be in her early 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that assessed him warily. The middle sister was maybe 18, with lighter brown hair and a face that might have been pretty if it wasn't pinched with cold and worry. The youngest couldn't have been more than 16, small and delicate with blonde curls escaping from a knit cap that had seen better days. All 3 wore clothes that had once been nice but were now wrinkled and dirty, as if they'd been sleeping in them for days. Their faces were pale with cold and exhaustion, and the youngest was shivering so hard her teeth chattered audibly in the quiet barn. Thomas felt his heart do something it hadn't done in 3 years. It broke for someone other than himself. "How long have you been here?" he asked gently. The oldest sister, clearly the spokesperson for the group, lifted her chin with a defiance that didn't quite hide her fear. "Since yesterday night. We didn't think anyone would come out here so early. Where are you from?" She hesitated, then said, "We were staying in town, but we had to leave." Thomas noticed she didn't say visiting town or passing through town. She said staying, which implied they'd been there for a while. And had to leave suggested they hadn't left by choice. "Are you running from someone?" he asked. The middle sister spoke up for the first time, her voice sharper than her older sister's. "We're not criminals, if that's what you're thinking." "I didn't say you were," Thomas replied. "But people don't usually spend the night in strange barns unless they're running from something or someone." The youngest sister took a step forward, and Thomas could see now that she wasn't just cold, she was sick. Her cheeks were flushed with fever, and her breathing sounded labored. "She needs medicine," the oldest sister said, following his gaze. "We all do, really, but Emma's the worst. We were hoping to find some help in town, but—" She trailed off, but Thomas could fill in the blanks. 3 young women, alone, probably with little money and no local connections. In a small town like Whitefish, strangers were noticed, and young women traveling without men were automatically suspect. They'd probably been turned away from the few motels, maybe even run out of town by well-meaning but suspicious locals. "What are your names?" Thomas asked. The oldest sister seemed to weigh her options before answering. "I'm Kate Morrison. This is my sister Julie, and this is Emma." Morrison. Thomas filed the name away, though he doubted it was real. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the way Emma swayed on her feet, the way Julie's hands shook with more than cold, the way Kate held herself like someone ready to fight or flee at the first sign of threat. "Well, Kate Morrison," Thomas said, "it looks like you and your sisters need help, and I've got a warm house with hot coffee and a medicine cabinet. The question is whether you trust me enough to accept it." Kate's eyes searched his face, looking for deception or hidden motives. Thomas let her look. He knew what she'd see: a tired, grieving man in worn clothes who moved like his bones ached and spoke like he'd forgotten how to talk to people. Not particularly threatening, just lonely. Finally, Kate nodded. "We don't have much choice," she said quietly. Thomas was already moving toward the barn door. "Then let's get Emma inside before she collapses." As he led the three sisters across the yard toward the house Sarah had dreamed of filling with children, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years: purpose. These young women needed help, and for the first time since Sarah died, he had something to offer besides his own grief. He didn't know their real names or where they'd come from or what they were running from. But he knew what Sarah would have done if she'd found 3 scared, sick young women hiding in their barn. She would have brought them inside, fed them, and asked questions later, and maybe, just maybe, doing what Sarah would have done was the first step toward finding his way back to being the man she'd loved. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The farmhouse kitchen hadn't seen 3 people at once since Sarah's funeral, when church ladies had bustled around making sandwiches and coffee for the mourners who came to pay their respects. Now watching Kate Morrison help her youngest sister into one of Sarah's chairs while Julie hovered protectively nearby, Thomas felt the strange sensation of his house remembering how to breathe. Emma collapsed into the wooden chair with a soft gasp of relief, her fevered cheeks flushed against her pale skin. In the better light of the kitchen, Thomas could see that all 3 sisters were in worse shape than he'd initially realized. Their clothes, while clean, showed the telltale signs of hand-washing in cold water and air-drying wherever they could find privacy. Julie's shoes had holes worn through the solace, carefully covered with duct tape that was beginning to peel. Kate's jacket was too thin for Montana weather, and her lips had a bluish tint that spoke of too many cold nights. But it was Emma who worried him most. The girl couldn't be more than 16, and she looked like she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and when she tried to remove her knit cap, her hands shook so badly that Kate had to help her. "When did she start feeling sick?" Thomas asked, moving toward the kitchen cabinet where Sarah had kept a well-stocked collection of basic medicines. "3 days ago," Kate replied, her voice tight with worry. "Started as just a cold, but it's gotten worse. She's been running a fever since yesterday." Thomas pulled down a bottle of ibuprofen and shook 2 tablets into his palm. "This will help with the fever. Julie, there's a glass by the sink. Can you fill it with water?" Julie moved quickly, grateful to have something useful to do. As she handed the glass to her youngest sister, Thomas noticed the way she kept glancing around the kitchen, taking inventory of exits and potential threats. The middle sister was the wary one, he realized. Kate was the protector, Emma was the innocent, but Julie was the survivor, the one who'd learned to read danger in every shadow. "I'm going to make some soup," Thomas announced, moving toward the refrigerator. "And tea, real tea, not the herbal stuff that tastes like grass." Kate started to protest. "You don't need to." "Yes, I do," Thomas interrupted, pulling out a container of leftover chicken broth. "You're in my house now, which makes you my responsibility. And the first rule of hospitality in Montana is that nobody leaves the table hungry." It was something Sarah used to say back when they still had people over for dinner. Back when the house felt alive with conversation and laughter, instead of echoing with the hollow sounds of one person trying to fill spaces meant for 2. As Thomas busied himself with heating broth and slicing leftover bread, he became aware of the sisters' careful silence. They weren't talking, but they were communicating quick glances, subtle hand signals, the kind of wordless language that develops between people who've learned to stay quiet, to stay safe. "How long have you been traveling?" he asked casually, stirring the soup. Kate and Julie exchanged one of their looks before Kate answered. "A few weeks. We started in Wyoming." "Long way from home," Thomas observed. We don't really have a home anymore, Emma said softly, then winced as Kate shot her a warning look. Thomas ladled soup into 3 bowls, Sarah's good bowls, the ones with the tiny blue flowers around the rim that she'd inherited from her grandmother. He'd eaten off paper plates for 3 years, but somehow it seemed important to use the real dishes now. Eat, he said simply, setting the bowls on the table. We can talk after you've got something warm in your stomachs. The sisters fell on the soup like they hadn't seen hot food in days, which, Thomas suspected, they probably hadn't. He made himself busy preparing tea and more bread, giving them privacy to satisfy their hunger without feeling watched or judged. But as he moved around the familiar kitchen, Thomas found himself really looking at this space for the first time. In years, the cheerful yellow walls Sarah had painted were now faded and marked with water stains from a roof leak he'd never bothered to fix properly. The curtains she'd sewn were gray with dust and hung crooked on bent rods. The little herb garden she'd kept on the windowsill was long dead, the pots holding nothing but dry soil and the brittle remains of plants he couldn't even identify anymore. It was a kitchen that had forgotten how to nurture, and seeing it through. The eyes of these 3 young women made Thomas suddenly ashamed of how far he'd let everything slide. This is really good, Emma said, looking up from her soup with the first genuine smile Thomas had seen from any of them. Did you make it yourself? The broth is from a chicken I roasted a few days ago, Thomas admitted. But the rest is just whatever vegetables I had lying around. It tastes like love, Emma said simply, then blushed as her sisters stared at her. I mean, it tastes like someone cared about making it good. Thomas felt something twist in his chest. When was the last time he'd cared about making anything good? When was the last time he'd cooked with any purpose beyond keeping himself alive? My wife always said food tastes better when you make it for someone else, he said quietly. Kate looked up sharply. Your wife? She died 3 years ago, cancer. The words came out easier than they had in a long time, maybe because these strangers had no expectations of how he should grieve or heal. I'm sorry, Kate said, and there was genuine sympathy in her voice. That must be very lonely. Thomas poured hot tea into mismatched mugs because Sarah had liked collecting them from different places they'd visited and set them on the table. It is, but today it's not. They drank their tea in comfortable silence as the morning sun climbed higher, painting golden rectangles across the kitchen floor. Emma's color was already improving, and the shivering had stopped. Julie had relaxed enough to lean back in her chair instead of perching on the edge ready to run. Even Kate's shoulders had dropped from their defensive hunch. Can I ask you something? Thomas said eventually. Kate tensed slightly. Depends what it is. Are you running from family, law, someone who hurt you? The silence stretched long enough that Thomas thought they wouldn't answer. Then Julie spoke up, her voice harder than her years should have allowed. Our stepfather, she said simply. After Mom died, he decided we were old enough to contribute to the household in ways we weren't willing to contribute. Thomas felt a cold anger settle in his stomach. He'd suspected something like this. 3 sisters traveling alone, clearly with limited resources, afraid to go to authorities for help. In small towns, stories like theirs were often met with suspicion rather than support, especially if the man they were running from was well respected in the community. How long since you left? He asked. 6 weeks, Kate said. We've been moving north, trying to get to Canada. Emma has an aunt in Calgary who said she'd help us if we could get there. That's still a long way, Thomas pointed out. And winter's coming early this year. You won't make it on foot, especially not with Emma sick. We know, Kate said quietly. We were hoping to earn enough money for bus tickets, but nobody wants to hire 3 young women with no references and no permanent address. Thomas finished. Kate nodded miserably. We tried in Whitefish yesterday, but the sheriff asked too many questions. Someone must have called him about us. Thomas wasn't surprised. Whitefish was a good town full of good people, but it was also small and insular. Strangers were noticed, and young women alone were automatically suspect. The locals would have been trying to protect them, but their protection would feel like persecution to 3 girls running from danger. "What did you tell the sheriff?" Thomas asked. "That we were visiting friends and just needed work to earn gas money for the trip home," Julie said. "But he kept asking which friends and where exactly we were staying, and we didn't have good answers. So you left town before he could dig deeper." "We spent the night in the woods outside town, but Emma got sicker, and it was so cold," Kate said. "When we saw your barn this morning, we just needed somewhere warm to rest and figure out what to do next." Thomas looked at the 3 of them, young, scared, sick, running from a man who should have protected them instead of threatening them. Sarah would have taken them in without hesitation. More than that, she would have moved heaven and earth to help them reach safety. "How much money do you need for bus tickets to Calgary?" he asked. Kate's eyes widened. "We can't ask you for money. You've already done so much." "You didn't ask," I offered. "How much?" Kate looked at her sisters, then back at Thomas. "About $300 for all 3 tickets." Thomas nodded. He had more than that in his checking account, not much more, but enough. Sarah's life insurance had paid off the mortgage and left him with a small cushion that he'd been too depressed to touch. Using it to help these girls reach safety seemed like exactly what Sarah would have wanted. "I can help with that," he said simply. All 3 sisters stared at him in shock. Emma started crying, not from sadness, but from relief so overwhelming it had nowhere else to go. "Why?" Kate whispered. "You don't even know us." Thomas looked around the kitchen that had been dying slowly for 3 years, at the table where he'd eaten alone for 1,000 meals, at the empty spaces where Sarah's laughter used to live. "Because sometimes helping someone else is the only way to help yourself," he said. "And because my wife would haunt this house forever if I turned away 3 young women who needed help." But even as he said it, Thomas knew the money was only part of what these sisters needed. Emma was too sick to travel immediately, and all 3 of them looked like they needed days of rest and proper food before they'd be strong enough for the long bus ride to Canada, which meant they'd be staying here in his house for at least a few days. The thought should have terrified him. He'd been alone so long that the idea of house guests seemed impossible. But instead, as he watched Emma smile through her tears and saw Kate's rigid shoulders finally relax, Thomas felt something he'd almost forgotten how to recognize. Hope. For the first time in 3 years, his house felt like a home again. By the 3rd day, the house had begun to remember what it was built for. Emma's fever had broken during the night, and Thomas woke to the sound of quiet laughter drifting up from the kitchen, a sound so foreign to these walls that he lay still for several minutes, convinced he was dreaming. But when he made his way downstairs, still pulling on yesterday's flannel shirt, he found Julie teaching Emma how to make pancakes while Kate sat at the table mending a tear in her sister's jacket with thread she'd found in Sarah's old sewing basket. "Morning," Kate said without looking up from her needlework. "Julie found pancake mix in your pantry. Hope that's okay." Thomas nodded, still adjusting to the reality of voices in his kitchen. "Sarah bought that mix," he said. "Must be 2 years old at least." "Still good," Julie announced cheerfully, flipping a pancake with practiced ease. "Expiration dates are more like suggestions anyway." Emma giggled, actually giggled, and Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. The girl looked like a different person than the fevered, shivering waif he'd found in his barn. Her cheeks had color again, her eyes were bright, and she moved with the natural energy of someone young and healthy, instead of someone fighting just to stay upright. "You're feeling better," he observed. "Much better." "Kate says it's because you have magic soup." Emma grinned at him. "She also says I need to eat more so I don't get sick again." "Kate's right," Thomas said, accepting a cup of coffee from Julie. About both things. As they settled around the table for breakfast, Thomas found himself studying the subtle changes that had occurred in just 3 days. Sarah's good dishes were back in regular rotation instead of gathering dust in the cabinet. The kitchen windows had been washed and the curtains straightened. Someone, probably Kate, had cleaned the coffee pot thoroughly, and it now produced coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of bitter water. Most striking of all was the way the house felt occupied again. Not just by bodies taking up space, but by lives being lived. Julie hummed while she cooked. Emma asked questions about everything: the farm, the animals, the framed wedding photo on the mantel. Kate contributed quiet observations and gentle corrections to her sisters, more enthusiastic impulses. They moved around each other with the easy choreography of people who'd learned to live in small spaces without friction. But they also moved around Thomas with careful consideration, never presuming but somehow managing to include him in their domestic rhythm. "I was thinking," Kate said as they finished breakfast, "maybe we could help with some work around here. To pay you back for your kindness." Thomas started to object. They were his guests, not his employees. But something in Kate's expression stopped him. This wasn't about money or obligation. This was about dignity, about being useful instead of just grateful. "The barn needs cleaning," he said finally. "And there's a lot of stuff in the spare rooms that probably should be sorted through." What he didn't say was that those spare rooms contained the accumulated remnants of Sarah's life boxes of clothes he'd never been able to donate, craft supplies for projects she'd never finished, books she'd loved and marked with her careful handwriting. He'd avoided those rooms for 3 years, but maybe it was time to face what was there. "I'm good with organizing," Kate offered, "and Emma loves going through old things." "I found some photo albums yesterday," Emma added excitedly. "While I was looking for extra blankets, they were in the hall closet. Would it be okay if I looked through them?" Thomas felt his throat tighten. Sarah's photo albums. He'd forgotten they were there, pushed to the back of the closet behind winter coats that still smelled faintly of her perfume. "Sure," he managed, "just be careful with them." After breakfast, they dispersed to their chosen tasks. Julie headed to the barn with a determined expression and a pair of work gloves that had belonged to Sarah. Kate disappeared upstairs to tackle the guest bedroom that had become a storage room for things Thomas couldn't bear to look at, but couldn't throw away. Emma settled in the living room with the photo albums, handling them with the reverence of someone who understood that pictures were more than just images. They were proof that love had existed. Thomas found himself at loose ends. For 3 years, his days had followed the same pattern: feed animals, check fences, perform whatever maintenance couldn't be postponed, sit in his truck listening to talk radio until it was late enough to go to bed. But with the sisters taking care of tasks he'd barely managed to keep up with, he was left with something he'd almost forgotten existed: free time. He wandered to the living room, where Emma had spread the photo albums across the coffee table, like treasure maps. She looked up when he entered, her expression both apologetic and fascinated. "She was beautiful," Emma said softly, indicating a wedding photo where Sarah laughed at something off camera while Thomas gazed at her with obvious adoration. "You both look so happy." Thomas sat heavily in his recliner. Sarah's chair had remained empty for 3 years, and he still couldn't bring himself to sit there. "We were happy for a while." "What was she like?" Emma asked, then quickly added, "You don't have to talk about her if it hurts." Thomas looked at the photo Emma had been examining: Sarah in her garden, dirt-streaked and grinning, holding a basket of tomatoes like they were made of gold. It did hurt to talk about her, but it was a different kind of hurt than the silence had been. This was the sharp, clean pain of a wound that might actually heal instead of the dull ache of something left to fester. She was joyful, he said. Finally, everything made her happy. New seeds in the spring, the first snow in winter, a good book, a perfect cup of coffee. She could find something to celebrate in just about any day. Emma smiled. My mom was like that. She used to say that happiness was a choice you made every morning when you woke up. What happened to her? Thomas asked gently. Emma's smile faltered. Car accident, 2 years ago. That's when we had to move in with Rick, our stepfather. Mom had married him the year before, but we barely knew him. And he changed after she died? He didn't change, Emma said quietly. He just stopped pretending to be decent when there was no one around to impress. From upstairs came the sound of boxes being moved, and Kate's voice calling down to ask if it was okay to throw away some old magazines. From the barn came Julie's voice singing something under her breath, the first time Thomas had heard her sing. They take good care of you, Thomas observed. Emma nodded. Kate's been like a mother since our real mom died. Julie pretends to be tough, but she's the one who always makes sure I have enough to eat, even if it means she goes without. I don't know what I would have done without them. Thomas studied the girl's earnest face and felt a familiar pang. This was exactly the kind of young woman Sarah would have loved to mentor, someone bright and curious and grateful for simple kindnesses. Sarah had always talked about the children they would have someday, the family they would build together. It was one of the cruelest ironies of cancer that it had taken not just Sarah's life, but also all the lives she might have touched, all the love she might have given. They're lucky to have you too, Thomas said. From what I can see, you bring out the best in both of them. Emma blushed and turned back to the photo albums. Can you tell me about some of these pictures? Like this one, where were you? For the next hour, Thomas found himself doing something he hadn't done since Sarah's funeral, remembering their life together out loud. He told Emma about their honeymoon trip to Yellowstone, where Sarah had insisted on hiking every trail despite her fear of bears. He described the weekend they'd spent building raised garden beds, how Sarah had researched the optimal soil composition for weeks beforehand but still managed to plant the tomatoes upside down. He explained how Sarah had learned to can vegetables from a neighbor lady who'd taken pity on her city girl ignorance, and how their first attempt at jam had turned into something that looked like purple concrete but tasted like heaven. He talked about the way Sarah sang off-key in the shower every morning, and how she always left books open and face down on every surface in the house, driving him crazy until the day she died, and he would have given anything to see just one more book abandoned mid-chapter on the kitchen counter. As he talked, Emma listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that stories were gifts. She asked thoughtful questions and laughed at the funny parts and looked appropriately solemn when he mentioned Sarah's illness. By the time Kate called them for lunch, Thomas realized he'd been talking about Sarah for over an hour without falling into the familiar pit of despair that usually opened up whenever her name was mentioned. The grief was still there, but it felt different somehow, less like a wound that would never heal and more like a scar that told the story of something precious that had been lost but not forgotten. Thank you, Emma said as they gathered up the photo albums, for sharing her with me. She sounds like she was an amazing person. She was, Thomas agreed. She would have liked you very much. As they headed to the kitchen for lunch, Thomas caught sight of himself in the hall mirror and was surprised by what he saw. He looked lighter somehow. Still tired, still marked by grief, but no longer quite so burdened. As if the simple act of sharing Sarah's memory had made the weight of carrying it alone a little easier to bear. In the kitchen, Kate had prepared sandwiches from bread Thomas had bought in town that morning, his first trip to the grocery store in weeks that wasn't purely functional. Julie had cleaned and reorganized the entire barn, she reported proudly, and found several tools that Thomas had given up for lost. As they sat around the table, eating lunch and sharing the small accomplishments of their morning, Thomas realized that for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't counting the hours until he could reasonably go to bed. For the first time in 3 years, He was actually living through his day instead of just surviving it. The house was waking up. And maybe, Thomas thought as he listened to the sisters plan their afternoon projects, so was he. The trouble started with a phone call on Thursday morning. Thomas was outside fixing a loose board on the front porch while the sisters worked in Sarah's old vegetable garden, clearing away 3 years of weeds and dead growth. Emma had convinced Kate and Julie that they should try to salvage what they could before the first hard frost, and seeing them bent over the raised beds with Sarah's gardening tools had stirred something in Thomas's chest that felt dangerously close to contentment. When the phone rang inside the house, he almost didn't answer it. The only people who called anymore were telemarketers and the occasional church member checking on his welfare. But something about the insistent ringing made him wipe his hands on his jeans and head inside. "Thomas Mitchell," he answered, slightly out of breath. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Sheriff Davies from Park County, Wyoming." The voice was official, professional, with an undertone that made Thomas's stomach clench. "I'm calling about 3 young women who may be in your area, sisters named Morrison." Thomas's blood went cold. Through the kitchen window, he could see Kate showing Emma how to tell which vegetables might still be salvageable, their heads bent together in concentration. Julie was loading dead plants into a wheelbarrow, humming the same tuneless melody she'd been humming all week. "I'm not sure what you're asking me, Sheriff," Thomas said carefully. "We received a report that they were seen in Whitefish a few days ago. I'm working with local law enforcement to locate them and return them to their legal guardian. Thomas closed his eyes, understanding immediately what that meant. Rick, the stepfather they'd been running from, had convinced authorities that he was the victim here. 3 ungrateful stepdaughters who'd run away and were probably causing trouble wherever they landed. "May I ask why you're looking for them?" Thomas asked. "Their stepfather is very concerned about their welfare," Sheriff Davies replied smoothly. "These girls have been through a traumatic loss with their mother's death, and they're not thinking. Clearly, Mr. Brennan, that's their stepfather, just wants them home safe where they belong." Brennan. So now Thomas had a name for the man who'd driven 3 young women to flee into the wilderness rather than stay under his roof. "What makes you think they might be in this area?" Thomas asked. "We've been tracking their movements north from Wyoming. Small towns, strangers get noticed. Someone in Whitefish mentioned seeing 3 young women matching their description asking about work. The local sheriff there said they left town quickly when he started asking questions." Thomas thought fast. The sisters had been here for 5 days now. If Sheriff Davies was calling him specifically, that meant someone had connected them to his property. But who? And how? "Have you considered that if these young women left voluntarily, they might have had good reasons?" Thomas asked. There was a pause. When Sheriff Davies spoke again, his tone had cooled considerably. "Mr. Mitchell, are you harboring these girls?" "I'm asking whether you've investigated the home situation they were running from," Thomas replied evenly. "In my experience, teenage girls don't usually flee into the wilderness without good cause." "Their stepfather has been nothing but cooperative," the sheriff said. "He's provided us with detailed descriptions, recent photos, even offered a reward for information leading to their safe return. Whatever these girls may have told you about their home situation, I can assure you that Mr. Brennan is a pillar of his community." Thomas felt a surge of familiar anger, the same helpless rage he'd felt watching Sarah suffer through treatments that made her sicker than the cancer itself, listening to doctors who spoke about her as if she wasn't in the room. Authority figures who thought they knew better, who couldn't be bothered to look beyond surface appearances to see what was really happening. "I haven't seen any young women matching that description," Thomas lied smoothly. "But if I do, I'll be sure to assess the situation carefully before making any calls. Mr. Mitchell, if you're hiding these girls, you could be charged with harboring runaways, possibly kidnapping. I strongly advise you to cooperate with our investigation." and I strongly advise you to investigate why 3 sisters would rather risk starvation and exposure than stay with their legal guardian. Thomas shot back. Good day, Sheriff. He hung up before Davies could respond, his hands shaking with adrenaline and fury. Through the window, he watched Emma discover something exciting in the garden, probably the winter squash that Sarah had planted in her final spring and that had somehow managed to survive and thrive despite 3 years of neglect. Emma called. Her sisters over, pointing excitedly at her discovery, and all 3 of them laughed at something Julie said in response. They looked happy. They looked safe. They looked like young women who were healing from trauma, not runaway delinquents who needed to be dragged back to an abusive situation. But if Sheriff Davies was calling him directly, that meant the net was tightening. Someone had seen the sisters here, or at least suspected they were here. It was only a matter of time before law enforcement showed up at his door with warrants and good intentions and absolutely no understanding of what they'd be destroying. Thomas stepped outside, and Kate looked up from the garden with a smile that faded the moment she saw his expression. What's wrong? She asked immediately. We need to talk. All of you, inside. The sisters exchanged worried glances but followed him into the kitchen without question. Thomas gestured for them to sit at the table while he paced to the window and back, trying to figure out how to explain without terrifying them. That was a sheriff from Wyoming, he said finally. He's looking for you. Kate went pale. Julie's hands clenched into fists on the table. Emma made a small, frightened sound. How did they find us? Kate whispered. Someone saw you in Whitefish and probably saw you here too. Small townspeople notice things. The sheriff says your stepfather has reported you as runaways and is very concerned about your welfare. That's bullshit, Julie snapped. Rick doesn't care about our welfare. He cares about losing his government checks. Thomas looked at her sharply. Government checks? Kate closed her eyes. We should have told you. After Mom died, we qualified for survivor benefits. Social Security payments until we turn 18, and money to help with college after that. Rick gets the checks as our guardian, so if you disappear. Thomas began. The money stops, Kate finished. It's not just about the other things he wanted from us. We're worth about $2,000 a month to him. Thomas felt sick. He'd known the stepfather was abusive, but learning that there was also a financial motive made everything worse. Rick Brennan wasn't just a predator, he was a predator with a powerful incentive to get the sisters back and keep them under his control. The sheriff mentioned a reward, Thomas said. Brennan's offering money for information about your location. Emma started crying, not the loud, dramatic tears of someone seeking attention, but the quiet, hopeless tears of someone who'd thought they were safe and had just learned they weren't. We have to run again, Kate said dully. Tonight. Before they come here. Where? Julie demanded. We barely made it this far, and Emma was sick. Winter's coming. Where are we supposed to go? I don't know, Kate admitted, and for the first time since Thomas had met her, the young woman who'd held her family together through unimaginable circumstances looked completely lost. Thomas stopped pacing and turned to face them. You're not running anywhere, he said firmly. All 3 sisters stared at him. This is my property, Thomas continued. I didn't see any young women. I don't know anything about any runaways. And if Sheriff Davies or anyone else wants to search my land, they're going to need a warrant. Thomas, you could get in serious trouble, Kate protested. They said harboring runaways. Let me worry about that, Thomas interrupted. I've been alone on this land for 3 years, and suddenly I have 3 young women who need my help. Seems like simple math to me. But why? Emma asked through her tears. Why would you risk so much for us? Thomas looked at her 16 years old, scared, still clutching one of the winter squash she'd found in Sarah's garden like a talisman, and felt something crystallize in his chest. Something that had been building for days, but that he'd been Afraid to name. Because Sarah would have done the same thing, he said. Because you've brought my house back to life. Because you've shown me that there's still good work to be done in this world, and maybe I'm not too broken to do it. He paused, looking at each of them in turn. And because sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do, and I've been taking the easy way out for too long. Kate wiped her eyes. What do we do? Thomas pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. With them, the first time he'd sat at Sarah's table as part of a family discussion in 3 years. First, we finish cleaning up that garden, he said. Then we prepare for visitors. And when they come, and they will come, we make sure they understand that this is our home, and we protect our own. For the first time since the phone call, Julie smiled. It was a fierce, determined smile that reminded Thomas of Sarah when she'd decided to fight the cancer instead of just accepting it. Our home, she repeated, testing the words. I like the sound of that. Through the kitchen window, Thomas could see the vegetable garden they'd been working on together, the raised beds that Sarah had built with such hope and that had lain fallow for 3 years until 3 strangers had arrived to bring them back to life. Tomorrow, Sheriff Davies or his colleagues would probably show up at Thomas's door with questions and suspicions and legal authority. But today, there was still work to be done, still vegetables to harvest, still a home to defend. And for the first time in 3 years, Thomas Mitchell felt like he had something worth fighting for. They came on Friday afternoon, just as Thomas had predicted. 2 patrol cars and an unmarked sedan rolled up the gravel drive like a small invasion force, dust clouds trailing behind them in the crisp October air. Thomas watched from the kitchen window as 5 men emerged from the vehicles, 2 local deputies he recognized from Whitefish, a man in a suit who had to be Sheriff Davies, and 2 others he didn't know but whose bearing screamed law enforcement. The sisters weren't in the house. As soon as they'd spotted the cars turning off the main road, Kay had shepherded Emma and Julie out the back door and into the old root cellar that Sarah had used for storing canned goods. It was cramped and cold and probably full of spiders, but it was also completely hidden beneath a layer of old boards and autumn leaves that Thomas had scattered there that morning. The plan was simple. Thomas would handle the authorities alone while the sisters stayed hidden. If things went badly, if the officers insisted on searching the property thoroughly, Kay had strict instructions to take her sisters and slip away through the woods to the old logging road that connected to the highway 2 miles north. Thomas had given her $100 in cash and the keys to his truck, which he'd parked on that same logging road the night before. But he hoped desperately that it wouldn't come to that. The knock on the front door was firm and official. Thomas took a deep breath, wiped his hands on his jeans, and went to answer it. Mr. Mitchell? The man in the suit was younger than his voice had suggested over the phone, probably mid-30s with the kind of clean-cut appearance that suggested military background. I'm Sheriff Davies, Park County, Wyoming. We spoke yesterday. Sheriff, Thomas nodded, not moving to let them in. What can I do for you? We'd like to ask you a few questions about the Morrison sisters. May we come in? Thomas glanced at the other officers, 2 locals who looked uncomfortable with whatever they'd been asked to do, and 2 men with federal badges visible on their belts. The situation was more serious than he'd anticipated. I told you yesterday, I haven't seen any young women matching that description, Thomas said. But you're welcome to ask your questions out here. Sheriff Davies smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Mitchell, we have reason to believe the girls are in this immediate area. Someone reported seeing 3 young women working in your garden yesterday afternoon. Thomas felt his heart rate spike, but kept his expression neutral. Mrs. Henderson. Probably. The neighbor 2 miles south who had a habit of using binoculars to birdwatch, but who somehow always seemed to spot more human activity than avian. I've been working on clearing that garden myself, Thomas said. Been neglected since my wife died. Maybe whoever saw me from a distance thought I was someone else. All three of them? One of the federal agents spoke up. Our witness was quite specific about seeing 3 individuals. Well then, your witness was mistaken, Thomas replied calmly. Unless you count the scarecrows my wife put up years ago. I've been meaning to take those down. The tension stretched between them like a wire pulled tight. Thomas could feel them weighing their options, considering how far they wanted to push without more concrete evidence. Mr. Mitchell, Sheriff Davies said finally, I need you to understand something. These girls are minors. Their legal guardian has reported them missing, and he's very concerned about their safety. If you're hiding them, you're not helping them, you're putting them in more danger. Danger from what? Thomas asked. The weather? Wild animals? Or the man they were running from? Davies's expression hardened. Mr. Brennan has been completely cooperative with our investigation. He's provided character references, employment records, financial documentation. He's a respected member of his community with no criminal history. And yet 3 teenage girls chose to flee into the wilderness rather than stay in his house. Thomas observed. Doesn't that suggest you might want to dig a little deeper into his character? We've conducted a thorough investigation. Have you talked to the girls' teachers? Their friends? Neighbors who might have seen something unusual? Thomas interrupted. Or did you just take the word of a man who stands to lose $2,000 a month if those girls disappear permanently? The federal agents exchanged glances. Apparently that particular detail hadn't been prominently featured in their briefing. Mr. Mitchell, one of them said, we need to search your property. Do you have a warrant? Another pause. We were hoping you'd cooperate voluntarily. I am cooperating, Thomas said. I'm answering your questions honestly. But if you want to search my property, you'll need a warrant. This is private land, and I know my rights. Sheriff Davies stepped closer, lowering his voice to a more conversational tone. Look, Mr. Mitchell, I understand you might think you're helping these girls. But they're underage runaways with no resources and winter coming on. Even if their home situation isn't ideal, at least they'll be warm and fed and safe. Safe, Thomas repeated flatly. Is that what you call it when a stepfather starts looking at his deceased wife's daughters as replacement wives? The words hung in the air like smoke. Davies's jaw tightened, but Thomas saw something flicker in one of the deputies. Eyes recognition, maybe, or suspicion. That's a serious accusation, Davies said. Do you have any evidence to support it? Do you have any evidence to refute it? Thomas shot back. Other than the word of a man who profits financially from keeping those girls under his control? Mr. Mitchell, if these girls told you stories about abuse, you need to understand that runaways often fabricate dramatic tales to justify their actions. Sheriff, Thomas interrupted, his voice going dangerously quiet. My wife died of cancer 3 years ago. I spent 2 years watching her fight for her life while well-meaning people told me what was best for her, what she should do, how she should feel. I learned that sometimes the people with badges and authority don't know a damn thing about what's really happening in someone's life. He stepped forward slightly, meeting Davies's stare. So if 3 scared young women showed up on my property asking for help, I'd give it to them. And I wouldn't hand them over to anyone without being absolutely certain they'd be safe. Including law enforcement? Especially law enforcement. If law enforcement was more concerned with closing a case than protecting the victims. The standoff stretched for a long moment. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat, could feel sweat gathering at the back of his neck despite the cool air. In the distance, a hawk cried out, or maybe it was a crow. He couldn't tell the difference anymore. Finally, the deputy who'd been silent until now spoke up. Sheriff, maybe we should take a step back here. If there are allegations of abuse, there are no verified allegations. Davies cut him off. Just the wild stories of 3 runaway teenagers and the speculation of a civilian who's admitted he'd harbor them. I didn't admit anything, Thomas said quietly. I said what I would do if the situation arose. That's not the same as saying it has arisen. The federal agents were getting impatient. Thomas could see it in their posture, the way they kept glancing toward the barn and the outbuildings, mentally cataloging places where 3 young women might hide. "Mr. Mitchell," one of them said, "we're going to get that warrant. And when we do, we're going to search every inch of this property. If those girls are here, we'll find them." "Then I guess you better get started on the paperwork," Thomas replied. Davies pulled out a business card and held it out. "When you change your mind, and you will change your mind, call me. The longer this goes on, the more trouble you're in." Thomas took the card, but didn't look at it. "Sheriff, let me ask you something. If those girls were your daughters, and they'd run away from an abusive situation, would you want some stranger to hand them over to the first authority figure who showed up with a badge? Or would you want that stranger to make sure they were actually going somewhere safe?" For just a moment, Davies's professional mask slipped, and Thomas saw the father underneath. But the moment passed quickly. "They're not my daughters," Davies said. "They're runaways with a legal guardian who wants them home." After the officers left, Thomas waited a full hour before going to the root cellar. When he lifted the camouflaged boards, he found all 3 sisters huddled together in the darkness, Emma crying silently while Kate and Julie flanked her like bodyguards. "It's okay," he said softly. "They're gone." But as the sisters climbed out of their hiding place, dirty and shaken and clinging to each other, Thomas knew it wasn't really okay. It was a temporary reprieve at best. The authorities would be back with a warrant within 24 hours. And next time they wouldn't be taking no for an answer. "What do we do now?" Kate asked, brushing spider webs from her hair. Thomas looked at the 3 young women who'd become his family in less than a week, who'd brought his house back to life and given him something to fight for. Then he looked toward the horizon, where the sun was setting behind the mountains in a blaze of orange and gold. "Now we figure out how to get you to Canada," he said. "Tonight." The plan would be dangerous, probably illegal, and almost certainly doomed to failure. But as Thomas watched Emma wipe away her tears and saw the fierce determination return to Julie's eyes, and witnessed Kate square her shoulders for whatever battle lay ahead, he realized he'd never been more certain of anything in his life. Some fights were worth the risk. Some people were worth protecting, no matter the cost. And sometimes, the only way to save a family was to help them disappear. The plan began with a phone call to Margaret Walsh. Though Thomas hadn't spoken to her in over 2 years, Margaret had been Sarah's closest friend, a retired teacher who lived 40 miles north in Kalispell and who had never quite forgiven Thomas for withdrawing from the world after Sarah's death. But Margaret was also a woman who'd spent 30 years helping troubled students navigate impossible situations, and Thomas was counting on that part of her nature being stronger than her irritation with him. "Thomas Mitchell," she answered on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the cool politeness reserved for people who disappointed her. "This is unexpected." "Margaret, I need your help," Thomas said without preamble. "And before you hang up, this isn't about me. It's about 3 young women who are in serious danger." There was a pause. Margaret had always been able to separate personal grievances from genuine emergencies. It was what had made her such an effective teacher. What kind of danger? She asked. Thomas gave her the essential details. 3 sisters fleeing an abusive stepfather, authorities trying to force their return, immediate need for safe passage to Canada. He didn't mention that they were currently hiding in his house, or that he was technically harboring fugitives. Some information was better shared in person. "And you want me to do what exactly?" Margaret asked when he finished. "I want you to drive to Calgary tomorrow," Thomas said. "There's a woman there named Susan Morrison, Emma's aunt. She's expecting the girls, but they need someone to vouch for them at the border. Someone with clean identification and a believable story." "Thomas, what you're describing sounds dangerously close to human trafficking." "Margaret, Thomas interrupted. These girls are 16, 18, and 20 years old. The youngest one was sick with fever when I found them hiding in my barn. They've been running for 6 weeks, sleeping in the woods, going hungry. Their stepfather collects their survivor benefits and wanted them to contribute to the household in ways that no young woman should ever have to contribute. Another pause, longer this time. When Margaret spoke again, her voice was gentler. Where are they now? Safe, for the moment. But not for long. And you think I should just drive to Canada with 3 strangers and hope the border guards believe? Whatever story we come up with. Thomas looked out the kitchen window, where the sisters were loading supplies into his truck by the light of a camping lantern. They'd spent the evening gathering everything they might need for a winter journey: blankets, food, extra clothes, the small amount of cash Thomas had been able to scrape together. I think you should do what Sarah would have done, Thomas said. Quietly. The silence stretched so long that Thomas wondered if Margaret had hung up. Then she sighed, a sound that carried 20 years of friendship and shared grief. Sarah would have driven to the ends of the earth for those girls, Margaret said finally. Yes, she would have. And she would have expected me to do the same. Yes, another sigh. Where do you want to meet? They arranged to rendezvous at dawn at the abandoned gas station on Highway 93, 20 miles north of Thomas's property. Margaret would approach from Kalispell, while Thomas brought the sisters up through back roads, avoiding the main routes where roadblocks might already be in place. After he hung up, Thomas found the sisters in the barn, making final preparations. Kate had braided her hair back severely and was wearing the plainest clothes she owned. Julie had done the same, but her nervous energy made her pace restlessly between the truck and the workbench where their supplies were arranged. Emma sat on a hay bale, clutching the small photo album Thomas had given her, pictures of Sarah's garden through the seasons, something to remember their brief sanctuary by. Margaret will meet us at 6 a.m., Thomas announced. She'll drive you the rest of the way to Calgary. What about you? Emma asked immediately. Thomas had been dreading this question. I can't cross the border with you. Too many complications, too many questions. But Margaret's a retired teacher with a clean record. And a sensible car. She'd get you there safely. But what will happen to you? Kate pressed. When they come back with that warrant and find us gone? Thomas shrugged with more casualness than he felt. I'll tell them the truth, that 3 young women showed up on my property asking for help. And I helped them. They can't prove I knew where you were going. And by the time they figure it out, you'll be safely in Canada. Julie stopped pacing and stared at him. You could go to prison. Maybe, probably not though. I'm a widowed veteran with no criminal record who's trying to help some kids in trouble. Most judges would be sympathetic. It was mostly true though. Thomas suspected the reality would be more complicated. The federal agent's involvement suggested someone high up the food chain was taking this case seriously, which meant the consequences for him might be more severe than he was letting on. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, his only concern was getting the sisters to safety. They left the farm at 4:30 in the morning, with the sky still black and the air sharp enough to cut. Thomas drove with his headlights off until they reached the main road, navigating by memory and the faint starlight filtering through the truck's windshield. The sisters huddled together in the bench seat beside him, silent and tense with the weight of leaving everything familiar behind once again. The back roads Thomas chose were rough and winding, logging routes that hadn't seen much traffic since. The mills closed 5 years earlier. They passed through ghost towns where rusted equipment sat like monuments to Montana's mining past, through forests where deer stood frozen in the truck's headlights like ancient spirits watching their passage. 20 minutes from their destination, Emma spoke for the first time since leaving the farm. I don't want to leave you, she said quietly. Thomas felt his throat tighten. I don't want you to leave either. But you can't stay, and I can't go. That's just how it has to be. It's not fair, Emma whispered. No, Thomas agreed. It's not. But fair and necessary aren't always the same thing. Kate reached across Emma to touch Thomas's arm. We'll write to you. When it's safe. Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He'd gone from being completely alone to having a family, and now he was about to be alone again. But this time, the loneliness would be different. This time, he'd have something to remember besides grief and regret. They reached the abandoned gas station with 10 minutes to spare. The building was a relic from the 1950s, its windows boarded up and its pumps long since removed. But the parking lot was large enough for vehicles to meet without drawing attention from the highway. Margaret's car was already there, a sensible Honda with Montana plates and a rosary hanging from the rearview mirror. She got out as Thomas pulled up, and he was struck by how much she'd aged in the 2 years since he'd seen her. Her hair was completely gray now, and she moved with the careful precision of someone fighting arthritis. But her hug, when she greeted him, was as fierce as ever. You look terrible, she said bluntly. Thin as a rail and pale as a ghost. It's good to see you too, Margaret. She studied his face in the dim light from her car's interior. Actually, you look better than the last time I saw you. Alive again. If that makes sense. Thomas glanced toward his truck, where the sisters were gathering their belongings. They saved my life. All 3 of them. I just want to return the favor. Margaret followed his gaze and watched Kate help Emma out of the truck while Julie shouldered a backpack with grim determination. They're just babies, Margaret murmured. Old babies, Thomas replied. Too old for their ages. The introductions were brief and awkward. The sisters were clearly frightened by this new development. Another stranger to trust when trust had been in such short supply. But Margaret had spent 30 years dealing with scared teenagers, and she quickly took charge, with the kind of calm authority that made people feel safe. I've got coffee in the thermos and sandwiches in the cooler, she announced. The drive to Calgary is about 4 hours, and we'll want to cross the border during peak traffic when they're processing a lot of vehicles. Kate stepped forward. Mrs. Walsh, why are you doing this? You don't know us. Margaret smiled, the same gentle smile she'd used on countless students over the years. Because Thomas asked me to. And because 30 years ago, when I was your age, someone helped me when I needed it most. Sometimes we pass kindness forward instead of back. The transfer of the sisters from Thomas's truck to Margaret's car felt achingly final. Emma cried openly as she hugged him goodbye, clinging to him like he was her father instead of a stranger she'd known for a week. Julie's goodbye was fierce and brief, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Kate's hug lasted the longest, and when she finally pulled away, she pressed something into his hand. Don't look at it until we're gone, she whispered. Thomas watched Margaret's taillights disappear into the gray dawn, carrying the 3 young women who'd brought his house back to life. The silence that settled around him felt different from the silence he'd lived with for 3 years, not empty, but full of possibility. Full of love given and received. When he finally looked at what Kate had pressed into his hand, he found a small piece of paper torn from one of Sarah's gardening notebooks. Written in Kate's careful handwriting were 4 words. Thank you for everything. And below that, in Emma's rounder script, we love you too. Thomas folded the note carefully and put it in his wallet, next to the prayer card from Sarah's funeral that he'd carried for 3 years. Then he climbed into his empty truck and drove home through the brightening morning, ready to face whatever consequences awaited him. Some risks were worth taking. Some people were worth saving. And sometimes the best way to honor the dead was to protect the living, no matter what it cost. Thomas made it home just as the sun crested the mountains, painting the farmhouse and barn in shades of gold that reminded him of Sarah's hair in summer light. The property looked exactly as it had a week ago, same weathered buildings, same rolling pastures, same fence lines stretching toward the horizon, but everything had changed. The silence that greeted him wasn't the oppressive quiet of abandonment. anymore. It was the expectant hush of a home waiting for its family to return. He spent the morning doing mundane tasks with unusual attention to detail. He fed the cattle, checked water troughs, repaired a loose board on the barn door that had been bothering him for months. In the house, he washed the breakfast dishes the sisters had left behind, carefully drying each piece of Sarah's good china. Before returning it to the cabinet, he made the beds in the guest rooms where Kate and Julie had slept, smoothing the covers and fluffing the pillows as if preparing for new visitors. It was busy work. He knew a way to keep his hands occupied, while his mind processed what he'd done. By now, Margaret and the sisters would be approaching the Canadian border. By now, law enforcement would probably be discovering that their warrant was worthless because their suspects were gone. The consequences would come soon enough. Thomas intended to meet them with dignity. At 11:30, Sheriff Davies arrived. Alone, Thomas watched from the kitchen window as the unmarked sedan pulled into his driveway, noting the deliberate slowness of the sheriff's movements as he got out of the car. This wasn't the aggressive urgency of yesterday's visit. This was the careful approach of a man who knew he was walking into a conversation that would change everything. Thomas met him on the front porch, coffee mug in hand, wearing the same work clothes he'd had on during their first encounter. He'd considered changing into something more formal, a button-down shirt, maybe, or the suit he'd worn to Sarah's funeral, but decided that presenting himself as anything other than what he was would be dishonest. "Sheriff Davies," Thomas said by way of greeting. "Mr. Mitchell." Davies climbed the porch steps slowly, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk." "I figured we would." Davies glanced toward the barn, then back at Thomas. "You want to tell me where they are?" "Canada, I hope," Thomas replied without hesitation. "Safe and far away from anyone who wants to hurt them." The sheriff's shoulders sagged slightly, as if he'd been hoping for a different answer despite knowing what he'd find. "When?" "This morning, before dawn." "How?" Thomas considered his options. He could lie, claim he didn't know the details, force Davies to piece together the evidence himself. But he was tired of deception, and the sisters were safely beyond reach now. "A friend of my late wife drove them to Calgary," Thomas said. "Margaret Walsh. She's a retired teacher with no criminal record and a clean driving history. If you're planning to go after her, you should know that she was doing a favor for me, not them. The girls never asked her for anything." Davies pulled out a small notebook and wrote something down. This friend, she knew what she was doing was illegal. She knew 3 young women needed help getting away from a dangerous situation, Thomas replied. Everything else was just paperwork. The sheriff looked up from his notebook, studying Thomas's face. "You realize I have to arrest you?" "I figured you would." "Harboring fugitives, aiding and abetting, possibly conspiracy to commit human trafficking, if the federal prosecutor wants to get creative." Davies's voice was matter of fact, but Thomas detected something else underneath: reluctance, maybe, or even respect. What about investigating why 3 sisters were so desperate to escape their legal guardian that they'd rather risk death in the wilderness? Thomas asked. Davies was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the pasture where Thomas's cattle grazed peacefully in the morning sun. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "We did investigate," he said finally. "After yesterday, after what you said about the money and the other allegations, we went back and looked harder at Rick Brennan." Thomas felt something shift in his chest. And we found some things that hadn't come up in the initial background check, complaints that were filed and then withdrawn. Neighbors who had concerns but didn't want to get involved. A pattern of behavior that suggested you might have been right about the home situation. Thomas set down his coffee mug with careful precision. "So those girls were telling the truth." "Looks like it. Brennan's been arrested on charges related to what we found. He won't be in a position to hurt anyone for a very long time." Relief flooded through Thomas so suddenly it made him dizzy. The sisters were safe, not just physically safe in Canada, but legally safe from the man who'd driven them to flee. They could come home if they wanted to, or they could stay in Calgary with their aunt, or they could go anywhere else in the world. The choice was theirs now. "That's good news," Thomas said quietly. "It is," Davies agreed. "But it doesn't change what you did. You harbored fugitives, helped them cross international borders illegally. There will be consequences." Thomas nodded. He'd known this moment would come from the instant he'd decided to help the sisters. What happens now? Davies pulled out a pair of handcuffs but didn't move to use them yet. "Now I arrest you, and you get a lawyer, and we see what the prosecutor wants to do." Given the circumstances, the fact that Brennan has been arrested, the fact that you were protecting victims of abuse, there's a good chance you'll get a plea deal. Community service, maybe, or probation. And if you don't, you could be looking at several years in federal prison. Davies paused. Was it worth it? Thomas thought about Emma's fever breaking in his kitchen, about Kate's careful stitching as she mended her sister's jacket, about Julie's off-key humming in the barn. He thought about Sarah's photo albums spread across the coffee table, about the way the house had felt alive again for the first time in 3 years, about the note folded in his wallet that said, "We love you too." "Yes," he said simply. It was worth it. Davies studied him for another moment, then made his decision. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The handcuffs were cold against Thomas's wrists, but not as cold as the metal had been when he'd first touched his wedding ring after Sarah's death. This was different. This was the weight of consequences chosen freely, of risks taken for the right reasons. As Davies led him toward the patrol car, Thomas took one last look at his property. The barn where he'd found 3 frightened girls hiding in the hay. The garden where they'd worked together to salvage what could be saved from years of neglect. The house where they'd sat around Sarah's table and become a family, however briefly. "Sheriff," Thomas said as Davies opened the car door. "Yeah? When this is all over, when the legal stuff is settled, do you think you could get word to them? To let them know they're safe to come home if they want to?" Davies nodded slowly. "I think that can be arranged." The drive to the courthouse in Whitefish took 20 minutes, past familiar landmarks that looked different somehow from the backseat of a police car. The diner where Sarah used to order coffee and pie every Sunday after church. The hardware store where Thomas had bought supplies for countless farm projects. The cemetery where Sarah's headstone marked the place, where his old life had ended. But as they pulled into the courthouse parking lot, Thomas realized that his old life hadn't really ended when Sarah died. It had ended this morning, when he'd watched 3 young women drive away to safety and felt his heart break and heal at the same time. What came next, whether it was prison or probation or something in between, would be part of a new life, one where he'd learned that the best way to honor Sarah's memory was to live by her values. The booking process was efficient and impersonal. Fingerprints, photographs, paperwork that reduced his actions to legal categories and statutes. Thomas answered the questions honestly and signed the forms where indicated, treating the whole procedure as just another kind of farm work, necessary, unglamorous, but ultimately leading to something better. His court-appointed lawyer was a young woman named Jennifer Chun, who looked like she should still be in law school but spoke with the confidence of someone who'd seen cases like his before. "Mr. Mitchell," she said as they sat in a small conference room at the courthouse, "I've reviewed the charges against you, and I've also reviewed the arrest of Rick Brennan. The prosecutor is willing to discuss a plea agreement." "What kind of agreement?" 6 months of community service, 2 years of probation, and a fine. In exchange, you plead guilty to a reduced charge of interfering with a police investigation. Thomas considered this. 6 months of community service meant 6 months of helping his neighbors, of being useful in his community instead of hiding away on his farm. 2 years of probation meant 2 years of checking in with authorities, of being accountable to someone other than himself. "What if I don't take the plea?" he asked. Jennifer's expression grew serious. "Then we go to trial, and you face the full charges. If convicted, you could be looking at 5 to 10 years in federal prison." Thomas thought about the note in his wallet, about the promise he'd made to the sisters that their sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. He thought about Sarah, who'd always believed that doing the right thing was worth whatever it cost. "I'll take the plea," he said, that evening. Thomas sat on his front porch for the first time since the sisters had left, watching the sun set behind the mountains and listening to the evening sounds of his farm coming alive. Cattle lowing in the distance, the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods, the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. The house behind him was quiet, but not empty. In the kitchen, Sarah's good dishes waited in the cabinet for the next family that might need them. In the guest bedrooms, the beds were made and ready for visitors. In the living room, Sarah's photo album sat on the coffee table, open to pictures of her garden in full bloom. Tomorrow, Thomas would begin his community service. He'd chosen to work with the local food bank, helping distribute meals to families in need. It seemed like appropriate penance for a man who'd learned the value of feeding people who were hungry for more than just food. But tonight, he simply sat and remembered 3 scared young women who trusted him with their lives. A house that had learned to breathe again. A heart that had discovered it still had room for love, even after lost dot in his pocket. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number with a Canadian area code. Made it safely. "Aunt Susan says hello and thank you. We'll write more when we can. Love, KJ&E." Thomas smiled and put the phone away without responding. Someday, when the legal proceedings were finished and it was safe to do so, he would write back. He would tell them about the community service, about the slow process of rebuilding his life, about how much their brief presence had changed everything. But for now, it was enough to know they were safe. It was enough to know that he'd done the right thing, whatever the cost. The stars were coming out, bright pinpricks of light in the vast Montana sky. Thomas pulled his jacket tighter and settled back in his chair, content to watch the night deepen around his home and his land and his memories of the week that had taught him how to live again. 6 months later, Thomas Mitchell stood in the parking lot of the Flathead Valley Food Bank at 5:30 on a Tuesday morning, watching his breath form clouds in the frigid January air. The building was a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Kalispell, painted institutional beige and surrounded by the kind of practical landscaping that suggested function over form. But inside, Thomas had discovered, was a kind of organized chaos that reminded him of Sarah's kitchen during harvest season, purposeful, urgent, and filled with the quiet satisfaction of feeding people who needed feeding. "Morning, Thomas," called Maria Santos as she unlocked the front door. Maria was the food bank director, a compact woman in her 50s who managed to be simultaneously no-nonsense and deeply compassionate. She'd taken one look at Thomas's court-ordered community service paperwork and assigned him to the early morning shift, where his natural inclination toward silence wouldn't interfere with the steady stream of conversation that marked the busier afternoon hours. "Morning, Maria," Thomas replied, following her into the warehouse. The familiar routine of switching on lights and firing up the ancient coffee maker had become as comfortable as his old morning chores on the farm. More comfortable, in some ways, because this work came with the knowledge that other people depended on it. The food bank operated on a simple principle: collect donations from grocery stores, restaurants, and private individuals, sort everything into categories, and distribute it to families who needed help putting food on their tables. Thomas's job was primarily in the sorting, checking expiration dates, organizing canned goods by type, assembling family-sized boxes that contained everything from pasta and peanut butter to fresh produce and frozen meat. It was methodical work that suited his temperament. But it was also work that brought him into contact with the hidden struggles of his community, in ways he'd never experienced during his years of isolation on the farm. "We've got a big delivery coming in from Costco this morning," Maria said, consulting her clipboard. "Mostly canned goods and some produce that's getting close to its sell-by date. And Mrs. Peterson called last night. Her church group wants to do another canned food drive." Thomas nodded, already mentally organizing the storage areas they'd need to clear. In 6 months of working here, he'd learned to anticipate the ebb and flow of donations and need. January was always tough. The holiday spirit of giving had worn off, but winter hardships were just reaching their peak. Heating bills climbed while work opportunities diminished, and families who'd managed to get by during the warmer months found themselves choosing between groceries and warmth. The first clients began arriving at 9 o'clock when the distribution center officially opened. Thomas worked in the sorting area behind the main counter, but he could see the steady stream of people making their way through the selection process. Some were regulars, elderly folks on fixed incomes, single mothers juggling multiple jobs, families dealing with medical emergencies that had wiped out their savings. Others were clearly new to the experience, their discomfort visible in the way they avoided eye contact and spoke in apologetic whispers. Thomas understood that discomfort. He'd felt it himself during the worst months after Sarah's death, when well-meaning neighbors had left casseroles on his porch, and he'd been too proud to admit how much he needed them. Around 10:30, a familiar voice drifted back from the distribution area, high, excited, unmistakably young. Thomas looked up from the box of cereal he was sorting and felt his heart skip a beat. Double quotes, ... and Thomas, "Mr. Mitchell, he taught me how to tell which winter squash were still good to eat, and we found some that had been growing wild in the garden for 3 years." Emma Morrison, talking to someone near the front counter, with the same animated enthusiasm she'd shown when describing Sarah's photo albums. Thomas set down the cereal box and moved closer to the doorway, where he could see without being seen. She looked different, healthier, more confident, wearing a thick winter coat that actually fit her properly and boots that showed no signs of duct tape repairs. Her hair was longer, pulled back in a neat braid, and her cheeks had the rosy glow of someone who'd been getting proper nutrition and adequate sleep. But her smile was exactly the same, bright and genuine and completely infectious. Standing beside her was a woman Thomas didn't recognize, middle-aged, with graying brown hair and the kind of practical winter clothing that suggested long experience with Canadian winters. This had to be Susan Morrison, the aunt who'd taken the sisters in. "Emma," the woman said gently, "we should let these folks get back to their work." But Maria had overheard Emma's story and was approaching with the expression she wore when she sensed a connection worth exploring. "Did you say Thomas Mitchell?" Maria asked. "The Thomas who works here?" Emma's eyes widened. "He works here? Is he ... is he here now?" Before Maria could answer, Thomas stepped out from the sorting area. For a moment, he and Emma simply stared at each other across the food bank's main floor, two people who'd been family for a week and strangers ever since. Then Emma crossed the space between them in 3 quick steps and threw her arms around him with the same fierce affection she'd shown on the morning they'd said goodbye. "I can't believe you're here," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I mean, I can believe it because it's exactly the kind of thing you do, but I can't believe we found you." Thomas hugged her back, overwhelmed by the simple joy of seeing her healthy and happy and safe. Over her head, he met Susan Morrison's eyes and saw a warmth there that suggested Emma had been telling the truth when she described their time on his farm. "What are you doing in Montana?" Thomas asked when Emma finally released him. "I thought you were settled in Calgary." "We are settled," Emma said quickly. "Aunt Susan is amazing, and we love Calgary, and Kate's in college now studying social work, and Julie got a job at a bakery where they let her experiment with new recipes. But," Susan added with an amused smile, "Emma has been talking about visiting Montana for months. When I had business in Kalispell this week, she convinced Me to make a detour. Business? Thomas asked. I'm a social worker, Susan explained. I was consulting on a case involving cross-border family reunification. Ironically, very similar to what my nieces went through. Thomas felt Maria's presence behind him and turned to include her in the conversation. Maria, this is Emma Morrison. And her Aunt Susan. Emma is, well, she's one of the young women I helped last year. Maria's expression shifted from curiosity to understanding. She'd never asked Thomas for details about his court case. The food bank worked with enough people in complicated legal situations that she'd learned. Not to pry, but she'd clearly connected the dots. You're the girls he went to jail for, Maria said simply. He didn't go to jail, Emma protested immediately. He got community service, which is completely unfair because he was helping us and saving our lives and being the most wonderful person in the world. Thomas felt his cheeks warm. Emma ... No, it's true, Emma insisted, turning back to Maria. We were running from our stepfather who was terrible and trying to hurt us. And Thomas found us hiding in his barn and took us in and fed us and made sure we got to safety, even though he could have gotten in huge trouble, which he did get in. Trouble, but not huge trouble, thank goodness. Susan placed a gentle hand on her niece's arm. Breathe, sweetheart. Emma took a deep breath, then grinned sheepishly. Sorry, I get excited when I talk about Thomas. Kate says I hero worship him, but Kate hero worships him too. She's just more subtle about it. How are your sisters? Thomas asked. Kate's amazing, Emma said immediately. She's studying social work at the University of Calgary, and she wants to specialize in helping kids who are aging out of foster care. She says you inspired her to help other people the way you helped us. Thomas felt something warm expand in his chest. And Julie? Julie's found her calling, Susan said with evident pride. She's working at a French bakery, and the owner is teaching her traditional techniques. She has a real gift for pastry work. She made croissants last week that were so good I cried, Emma added. Happy tears though, not sad tears. Thomas smiled, imagining Julie fierce, protective Julie carefully shaping delicate pastries with the same determination she'd shown while defending her sisters. What about you? He asked Emma. Are you in school? Emma's expression grew more serious. I'm finishing high school, but I'm also volunteering at a youth shelter. Kids who are in situations like we were running from bad homes, sleeping rough, not knowing who to trust. I tell them our story sometimes, about how one good person can change everything. Thomas felt his throat tighten. Emma ... Uddy. It's true. She said firmly, you changed everything for us. Before we met you, we were just surviving. After we met you, we remembered how to live. Maria cleared her throat gently. I hate to interrupt this reunion, but we do have other families waiting for assistance. Thomas looked around and realized that their conversation had drawn the attention of several other food bank clients, some of whom were watching with open curiosity. Of course, Susan said immediately. We should let you get back to work. But Emma wasn't ready to leave yet. Thomas, are you happy? I mean, really happy? Because when we left, you looked so sad and I worried about you being alone again. Thomas considered the question seriously. Was he happy? He thought about his morning routine at the food bank, the satisfaction of organizing donations and knowing that his work would help families eat better that week. He thought about the small conversations he'd begun having with other volunteers, the gradual expansion of his world beyond the boundaries of his farm. He thought about the letters he'd finally begun writing to Margaret Walsh, the tentative renewal of friendships he'd abandoned in his grief. I'm not alone anymore, he said finally. Working here, being part of the community, it's taught me that there are a lot of different ways to have a family. Emma beamed. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. As they prepared to leave, Susan pressed a business card into Thomas's hand. My contact information, she explained. The girls would love to stay in touch properly now that the legal situations are resolved. And this is for you, Emma added, pulling a thick envelope from her purse. Letters from Kate and Julie, and pictures of our apartment, and a recipe. Julie wrote down for the soup you made us that first morning. She says it tasted like love, and she wants to be able to make it when she misses you. Thomas accepted the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. Thank you. No, Emma said, standing on her tiptoes to kiss his cheek. Thank you for everything. For saving us, and for showing us what kindness looks like, and for becoming our family when we needed one most. After they left, Thomas returned to his sorting. Work with a lightness in his chest that he hadn't felt since the morning he'd watched Margaret's car disappear into the dawn. The envelope sat on the counter beside him, unopened, but radiating the warmth of connection, renewed at lunch break. He finally opened it and found 3 separate letters, each written in a familiar hand. Kate's letter was thoughtful and detailed, describing her college classes and her plans for the future. Julie's was shorter but filled with humor and observations about Canadian life that made him laugh out loud. Emma's was the longest, a rambling account of everything she'd done and seen and learned in the past 6 months, punctuated with questions about his life and expressions of affection that made his eyes sting. But it was the photographs that affected him most deeply. The 3 sisters in their new apartment, laughing around a kitchen table. Kate in her college graduation gown, apparently she'd accelerated her studies. Julie in chef's whites, proudly displaying a tray of pastries. Emma at her volunteer job, reading to a group of younger children. They looked like what they were, young women who'd been given the chance to build the lives they'd always deserved. That evening, Thomas sat at his kitchen table, Sarah's table, and began to write. Not just a response to their letters, but the story of his own transformation. The way working at the food bank had taught him that isolation wasn't healing. It was just another kind of death. The way helping other people had shown him that the best memorial to Sarah wasn't preserving everything exactly as she'd left it, but continuing to live by the values she'd embodied. The way 3 scared young women had taught him that family wasn't just about blood or marriage certificates, was about choosing to love someone enough to sacrifice for their well-being. Outside, snow began to fall, but Thomas's house was warm and bright, filled with the quiet contentment of a man who'd learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. Tomorrow he'd return to the food bank, where other people needed the kind of help he'd learned to give. Tonight, he had letters to write and memories to cherish and plans to make for the future he was finally ready to embrace. 2 years after his community service ended, Thomas Mitchell stood in his kitchen on a bright June morning, watching 3 young women argue good-naturedly about the proper way to arrange flowers while they prepared for the most important day of his life since Sarah's funeral. But where that day had marked an ending, this one promised a beginning, or perhaps a continuation of something that had started the morning he'd found 3 frightened sisters hiding in his barn. Emma, you can't just shove all the delphiniums together like that, Kate was saying, her voice carrying the patient authority of someone who'd spent 2 years studying human behavior. They need to be distributed throughout the arrangement for proper visual balance. Since when are you an expert on flower arranging? Julie shot back, carefully adjusting a spray of baby's breath with the same precision she brought to tempering. Chocolate, you're a social worker, not a florist. I'm a social worker who reads books about everything, Kate replied with dignity, including floral design. Emma, now 18 and radiating the confident energy of someone who'd found her purpose in life, held up her hands in mock surrender. Okay, you're both right. Kate, you handle the visual balance. Julie, you handle the ... I don't know, the flower psychology. Thomas, help me out here. Thomas smiled, setting down his coffee cup to join them at the kitchen island where they'd spread out enough flowers to stock a greenhouse. Sarah's kitchen had never seen such organized chaos, and he suspected his late wife would have loved every minute of it. I think, he said diplomatically, that Sarah would have said flowers are happiest when they're arranged by people who love each other, regardless of their technical expertise. All three sisters paused in their flower-related debate to look at him with expressions that ranged from amused to exasperated. You can't solve every argument by invoking Sarah's wisdom, Julie pointed out. Eventually we're going to disagree about something she never would have had an opinion on. Like what? Thomas challenged. Like whether pineapple belongs on pizza. Emma said immediately. Sarah loved pineapple on pizza, Thomas replied without missing a beat. See? Julie threw up her hands. It's like you've turned her into the patron saint of conflict resolution. Thomas considered this. In the 4 years since Sarah's death, her memory had indeed evolved from a source of paralyzing grief into something more like an internal compass, a way of checking his decisions against the values she'd embodied. But it was Kate who understood the deeper truth. He's not using Sarah to solve our arguments, she said quietly, still working on the flower arrangement. He's using our arguments to keep Sarah alive. There's a difference. The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of scissors snipping stems and water running in the sink. Through the window, Thomas could see the restored vegetable garden where the sisters had first worked to clear away years of neglect. Now it flourished under the care of Margaret Walsh, who'd moved to a small apartment in Whitefish after selling her house in Kalispell, and who'd become something of a surrogate grandmother to all three. Morrison's sisters. Margaret would be arriving soon with the final load of food for the reception, along with Father Kowalski from St. Matthew's and the small group of friends and neighbors who'd become Thomas's chosen family over the past 4 years. It wouldn't be a large gathering, but it would be exactly right for the occasion they were celebrating. Thomas, Emma said suddenly, are you nervous? He considered the question seriously. Was he nervous? About the ceremony, about the changes it would bring, about the weight of the promises he was about to make. A little, he admitted, but good nervous. Like standing at the edge of something wonderful instead of something terrifying. Kate looked up from her flowers with the expression she wore when she was analyzing human behavior for her case files. Do you think Sarah would approve? It was a question Thomas had wrestled with for months, ever since he'd realized that what had started as renewed friendship with Margaret Walsh had slowly, carefully evolved into something deeper. The guilt had been crushing at first, the sense that moving forward meant leaving Sarah behind, that choosing happiness meant betraying her memory. But it was Emma who'd helped him see the situation differently during one of their regular phone conversations. Thomas, she'd said, with the clarity that sometimes came from youth, untainted by adult complications, Sarah loved you enough to want you to be happy after she was gone. Not loving anyone else won't bring her back, but it might prevent you from becoming the person she hoped you'd be. I think, Thomas said carefully, that Sarah would want me to be happy. And I think she'd love Margaret almost as much as I do. Julie smiled, a soft, genuine expression that transformed her face. Sarah had good taste in friends. It makes sense. She'd have good taste in her replacement, too. Margaret's not replacing Sarah, Thomas corrected gently. She's just adding to the story, different chapters in the same book. The sound of tires on gravel announced Margaret's arrival, along with what sounded like several other vehicles. Through the window, Thomas could see his driveway filling with familiar cars. Father Kowalski's ancient pickup truck, the sheriff's personal vehicle, Davies had become an unexpected friend over the years, and a rental car that probably contained the surprise guests Kate had been mysteriously hinting about for weeks. They're here, Emma announced unnecessarily, bouncing on her toes with excitement. Thomas, you should go get changed. We'll finish the flowers. Thomas looked down at his work clothes, the same style of flannel shirt and jeans he'd been wearing. The morning he'd found the sisters in his barn, though considerably cleaner and without holes. For today, he'd chosen his best shirt, The one Sarah had bought him for their last anniversary together, and the suit jacket that had hung untouched in his closet since her funeral. But first, he had something to give the sisters. "Before I go upstairs," he said, reaching into the kitchen drawer where he'd been keeping 3 small wrapped packages for the past month. "I have something for each of you." The sisters exchanged glances. They'd clearly been expecting this moment, and gathered around him with the anticipation of children on Christmas morning. Emma opened hers first, revealing a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. Inside was a tiny photograph of the 4 of them taken during their reunion at the food bank, along with an even smaller picture of Sarah in her garden. "So you'll always have both families with you," Thomas explained as Emma's eyes filled with tears. Julie's gift was a wooden recipe box that Thomas had made himself, filled with index cards containing every recipe Sarah had ever written down, along with some new ones Margaret had contributed. "For when you open your own bakery," he said. Kate's present was the heaviest, a leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. "For your case notes," Thomas began, but Kate was already shaking her head. "This is too expensive," she protested. "Open it," Thomas said. Inside the front cover, in Thomas's careful handwriting, was a dedication for Kate Morrison, who taught a broken man that healing is possible and that families come in many forms. May you help others find their way home. Below that, Sarah's handwriting copied from one of her old letters added, "The most important work we do is love each other." All 3 sisters were crying now, but they were the good kind of tears, the ones that came with overwhelming gratitude instead of grief. "We have something for you too," Kate said, wiping her eyes, "but you have to wait until after the ceremony." "Is it the surprise guests you've been hinting about?" Thomas asked. Emma and Julie looked at Kate, who nodded permission. "Aunt Susan flew in from Calgary," Emma said, "along with some other people you'll want to see." Before Thomas could ask for more details, Margaret's voice drifted in from the front porch, calling his name with the mixture of affection and exasperation that had become her signature tone. "I better go," Thomas said, kissing each sister on the forehead in turn. "Try not to destroy the kitchen while I'm getting ready." "No promises," Julie called after him as he headed for the stairs. In his bedroom, the room he'd shared with Sarah for 15 years and slept alone in for 4, Thomas changed into his good clothes with unusual care. The face that looked back at him from Sarah's antique mirror was different from the one that had stared, hollow-eyed, into the same glass 4 years earlier. Older, yes, and marked by grief that would never fully fade, but also peaceful in a way he'd thought was lost forever. The ceremony was simple, held in the backyard under the cottonwood trees, where Sarah had dreamed of hosting Emma's wedding someday. Margaret stood beside him in a dress the color of summer sky, her graying hair crowned with flowers that Kate had insisted on weaving into a makeshift tiara. Father Kowalski spoke about second chances and unexpected blessings, about the way love could grow in ground that had been broken by loss. But it was the gathered witnesses that made Thomas's throat tight with emotion. The sisters, of course, standing together like a receiving line of joy. Margaret's son and daughter-in-law, who'd driven down from Seattle to welcome Thomas into their family. Sheriff Davies and his wife. Maria from the food bank with several other volunteers. Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor who'd reported seeing the sisters years earlier and who'd spent the intervening time bringing Thomas casseroles and gossip in equal measure. And in the back, partially hidden behind the small crowd, 3 figures Thomas had hoped to see but hadn't dared expect. Aunt Susan, beaming with maternal pride, and beside her 2 young men who looked like older versions of the Morrison sisters. "My cousins," Emma whispered during the exchange of rings. "David and Michael. They wanted to meet the man who saved their sisters." After Father Kowalski pronounced them husband and wife, after Margaret kissed him with a sweetness that tasted like hope and second chances, after the small crowd erupted in applause that sent the birds scattering from the cottonwood branches, Thomas found himself surrounded by people who'd become his family in ways he'd never imagined possible. The reception flowed naturally from ceremony to celebration, with Margaret's carefully planned menu supplemented by dishes contributed by nearly every guest. Julie had made the wedding cake, a simple white confection decorated with sugar flowers that looked almost real, and Emma had organized a photo session that captured every possible combination of family groupings. But it was later, as the sun began to set and the party settled into the comfortable rhythm of old friends sharing stories, that the sisters presented their gift to Thomas. "It's not really a thing," Kate said, holding out a manila envelope with characteristic Morrison sister ceremony. "It's more like ... a promise." Inside the envelope was a legal document that took Thomas several moments to understand. When he finally grasped what he was reading, he had to sit down in one of the folding chairs Margaret had borrowed from the church. "You want to change your name to Mitchell?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We want to be officially adopted," Emma corrected. "By both of you." Margaret said she'd be honored to be our stepmother, even though we're all adults now. Thomas looked up at Margaret, who was wiping tears from her cheeks with a handkerchief that had belonged to her own mother. "I may not have given birth to them," Margaret said, "but they're my daughters in every way that matters, and they're yours too." Julie stepped forward, uncharacteristically emotional. "You saved our lives, Thomas. But more than that, you showed us what a real father looks like. We want to make it official." "If you'll have us," Kate added quietly. Thomas looked around at the faces watching him, his new wife, his chosen daughters, his extended family of friends and neighbors who'd helped him build a life worth living. 4 years ago, he'd been a man slowly dying of loneliness and grief. Now he was surrounded by more love than he'd ever imagined possible. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes, I'll have you, all of you." As the evening deepened and the celebration continued around them, Thomas found himself standing with Margaret in the garden where Sarah had once dreamed of growing enough vegetables to feed half the county. The raised beds were full of summer plants, now tomatoes and peppers, herbs and flowers, all tended with the same love Sarah had brought to her gardening. "Do you think she knows?" Margaret asked quietly, following his gaze to Sarah's memorial stone, which was surrounded by the wild roses she'd planted in their first spring on the farm. Thomas considered the question, thinking about the chain of events that had brought them all to this moment. 3 frightened sisters hiding in his barn. A choice to help instead of turn away. A community that had rallied around them all. Love that had grown in soil that had been broken by loss. "I think," he said, taking Margaret's hand as laughter drifted toward them from the house where their daughters were probably planning some new adventure, "that this was always part of her plan." Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a nightingale began to sing. The sound was pure and clear and full of promise, not an ending, but a beginning that honored everything that had come before while embracing everything yet to come. Thomas Mitchell was no longer alone. He had a wife who loved him, daughters who chose him, and a community that had taught him the difference between surviving and living. It had taken him 4 years and 3 brave young women to find his way back to hope, but now that he'd found it, he intended to hold on tight. The story that had begun with grief and isolation had become something entirely different. A story about the family we choose, the love we build from broken pieces, and the way helping others helps us heal ourselves. And in the house that had learned to breathe again, in the garden that bloomed with new life, in the hearts that had discovered love was always possible even after loss. Sarah's dreams lived on not as memories trapped in the past, but as seeds that had grown into something beautiful and unexpected and exactly right. The night was warm, the stars were bright, and Thomas Mitchell was finally completely home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.